It's Friday, and welcome to another edition of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. I'm John Zogby, pollster, and with me, as always, is my son, Jeremy Zogby, pollster. We are business partners as well as father and son, taking a look at some of the hot issues in the news, never afraid to comment and never afraid to disagree, although we've been known to agree here and there. Hey, Jer, how are you this week?
Good morning. It's great to be back.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and this one actually just popped into my head because I'm starting to hear it. I'm starting to hear it in some of the uh, liberal organs like the New York Times and the Nation and Washington Post and so on. Here's the question: Is the Democratic Party, as we know it, dying? And the root of the question is, from some leading columnists, Frank Bruni, for example, the New York Times, Charles Blow at the New York Times. And the notion is that twice now they've ridden in to the White House and to Democratic majorities simultaneously, first with Barack Obama, and then, of course, in 2020 with a big victory by Joe Biden. Things were pretty heady for the Democrats, and yet the promises were flattened out. There was a lot of disappointment. One of the things that you'll always hear about Barack Obama was that he was a great visionary, but he couldn't get it done. Here we are 9 months into the Biden presidency, all kind of wondering what's going on with Joe Biden as we see his polling numbers. I'm not going to say plummet. That's too dramatic. One approval rating was at 38% last week. But generally speaking, he is in a typical place for presidents 1 year in office, mid 40s. Nothing to brag about, but a loss in support from where he was when he was elected, 52%. But the bottom line is a big agenda on the climate and on infrastructure, on voting rights, on Build Back Better, and very little legislative accomplishments to talk about. Are we expecting too much from Joe Biden? Is he a transitional president? Is he or could he be a transformational president? Or in the final analysis, will he go down in history? Is he on the road to going down in history as inconsequential? What do you think? And then I'll weigh in.
I'm going to have you go first.
Okay. All right. Um, First of all, I think that the president has made a couple of mistakes. It's the same sort of thing that I talked about when George W. Bush was president and said, we're going to capture Osama bin Laden and we're going to make him pay, dead or alive. And I thought to myself, don't say that unless you've got him handcuffed already and are ready to push the back of his head into the patrol car. Don't say you're going to do something unless you know you've got a reasonable chance at doing something. We've located him in the crosshairs. We've got SEAL Team 6 on its way. Same as I thought with Barack Obama as things worsened in Syria, and he drew that famous red line saying, this is the point at which we act, knowing full well he didn't have the resources, he didn't have public opinion, he didn't have half the generals, he didn't have Congress on his side. And so my fear, I'm a Biden supporter. My fear is that President Biden raised expectations, created a vision, I think a good one. I think the vision is absolutely what is necessary, even at its highest spending levels. But that perhaps when you raise expectations too high, you're doomed to failure. And then, I mean, what do I mean when I say raise expectations too high? That you don't talk about it and try to sell it until you got the votes lined up. And perhaps the old days, like the Lyndon Johnson days, when you had the votes lined up and then you secured additional votes by hook or by crook. That was the Johnson method. Either dossiers on some leading senators and congressmen that he needed support, or look at the number of military bases that were named after a lot of Southern congressmen and senators simply because he wanted and needed their vote and was able to exchange that. Um, I think Biden raised expectations, and at this point has not been able to deliver. I'm not going to say that he can't or even that he won't, but at least at this point, he's not doing well.
Well, there are two separate questions here at play. One is about the party, and the question you raise as to whether they're dead, and then the other is about the presidency of Joe Biden. I mean, looking at the party, I don't think that the party as we know it is going to disintegrate and have a tombstone RIP on it. Although I would say that at this point, it's looking like the midterm elections are not looking good for the Democrats, and that's really all the way, from the party leadership and President Joe Biden to the bottom, at the county level. I mean, first thing is we could say is the border crisis, and it's my understanding that Barack Obama has labeled the border crisis unsustainable, and potentially we're looking at this year into the next year 1 to 2 million people pouring into the border, and let's face it, we're at a point right now where you have the threat, the specter of 70 styles inflation brewing in this country. And so it raises the question, can America handle that with this brewing economic crisis that's building? And actually, the talk of inflation has become an everyday part of lexicon. People talk about it. Everyday people talk about it. It was something nobody talked about in the past, but now it's in everyday spoken about phenomenon. I mean, of course, you have the only talk seems to be about trillions here and trillions there. That if we're going to do anything about this country, legislation has to conjure up out of thin air trillions of dollars. The only other time in my knowledge that something like that has happened was during the pandemic relief, and that was supposed to be a 1, 2, maybe 3 deal and done. But now we're crossing the Rubicon, where if we pass this $3.5 trillion package, there's no return. That's going to be the expectation. Gone will be the day of, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It'll be completely the conversation. What are you going to do for me? What is the country going to do for us? And to me, that signals the prospect of a failed state, when that's about the only solutions that can be talked about. I understand the suffering that's going on, but if those are the only solutions that can be talked about, it doesn't look good for leadership.
Let me stop you for a second, if that's all right. Well, no, finish your point, and then I'll stop you.
Yeah, and then you've got, and then on a more educational level, you have the things like critical race theory, and of course you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, probably even more, real concerned parents, soccer moms, everyday Americans who are going to board meetings in their local schools and expressing their concerns about some pretty awful, horrific things that are being taught in the schools. And actually, this goes beyond critical race theory, but in extreme cases, um, in school districts in Virginia, basically pornographic material in in um, in novels, some of which have touched on pedophilia, and parents who go there and express their concerns, and their mics are shut off, they're dragged out of the meetings, that they're painted as domestic white nationalists, this and that. And so what I'm describing right now is, no doubt about it, a pressure cooker that a lot of Americans are feeling like they're being cooked in. And I think you're going to see rage boil over that's going to play out in the midterm election. And it doesn't look good for a party that's trying to ram a lot of these things down the throat of the other half of America.
I get that. I get everything you said. And that is what prompted the question, is the Democratic Party losing or dying? So a few comments and questions. The first is a question: what happens if the soft infrastructure in some form, legislation, does not pass? Now, it's at $3.5 trillion. Joe Manchin indicated that he'd settle for $1.5 trillion. Word out is that he could go as high as 2.1 trillion. But what happens if none of that is spent? Now, I know that's an awful lot of money, and I know that that's an awful lot of debt. I also know the Republicans can't really talk and take the high road on debt because the national debt grew by $7.5 trillion under President Trump's 4 years. Republicans only care about the national debt when a Democrat is in office, and I know that that that's true. But what happens if the money isn't spent? I'm thinking already in the private sector, we've got two very powerful unions that are on strike in the midst of this mess. The United Auto Workers, for one, and the IATSE union, that's stage and theatrical motion picture workers, working under pretty horrid conditions, let alone inadequate pay. But we've had this conversation many times before, something has to be done. And it doesn't seem as if we're able to leverage those in the private sector to rise to the need and take care of the foundations of this economy. Where does childcare and family leave come from? Where does the broadband that we all know that we need, particularly in rural areas, where does that come from? Where do a myriad of social needs and more equity, and I'm not saying more equality, I'm just saying more equity in economy, come from without federal government action, largesse, and leverage? That's my first comment and question.
Yeah, I mean,
Or do we just let people swim on their own?
well, I mean, that's, if it's put that way, then it's set up to say there's no other possible way. But in the study, in the field of economics, there's the seen and the unseen. And so while you want to talk about how this is going to go to alleviate suffering, little is paid attention to not only the malinvestment, but the misallocation of capital. I mean, we know when government gets involved, the enormous amount of waste, the enormous amount of corporate welfare, that there are people baked in to some of these deals who are going to get the contracts. They're not competing for it in a meritocratical way. It's handed to them. There's waste. Other things are thrown into the legislation. In this current form, the legislation, somewhere in the thousands of pages of wording, is the IRS being able to look at every transaction above $600. I mean, a complete surveillance state. Who knows what else gets rolled into that, and all the pork and all the waste. So While the public relations may talk about the alleviation of suffering, it'll never talk about the misallocation of capital. It'll talk about the suffering that it's supposed to end in the present, but it won't talk about the suffering that it will create in the future, because who's going to pay for all of that? While we alleviate the suffering of potentially of people now, you're just putting the bill on future generations. And I don't think that that's necessarily good for our grandkids. Um, but about the private sector, I mean, it's my understanding that the private sector is being suffocated. I mean, not only just because of regulations, but because the pandemic and some of these draconian measures, which shut businesses down and small businesses gone, and millions of Americans who find it that it's more lucrative to collect unemployment checks than it is to go back to work. Meanwhile, you look at Sweden, who didn't take a draconian approach to the lockdown. They said, look, if you're 65 and older, and if you're somebody who's susceptible to this disease, we encourage you to stay home, but we're not gonna basically at gunpoint put you on house arrest and force you to do this and force businesses to close. And Sweden has emerged from the pandemic as one of the least human toll taken on their country. So, I mean, really, that's what's happened to the private sector.
So let's talk about the original question. We measure whether a party is doing well or not doing well by election. We've got 2000. Well, we have 2017 coming up. Virginia has its gubernatorial election always, and it's a one-term governor, but it has its gubernatorial election. The in the odd number year, the first year after a new president, and so it's a bellwether. And right now, we have Terry McAuliffe running against a conservative by the name of Youngkin. And while it had been an 8 to 10 point lead by McAuliffe, the Democrat, right now it's anywhere from a tie to a 2 or 3 point lead by McAuliffe. If McAuliffe loses, that will really raise the hackles of a lot of press, and there will be a lot of soul searching, being conducted by the Democrats, because Virginia's been pretty blue. Its major statewide officials have been Democrat now for well over a decade, and it's voted Democrat in presidential elections right straight through now for a number of years. So we're watching that one, of course, very, very closely. If McAuliffe loses, that's a very poor sign for the Democrats, and for a bunch of reasons. One is the optics of it all. The other is that what we're really looking at is Democratic turnout. If the Democratic base turns out anywhere where there's a competitive election, Democrats win. If that base, which is non-white and tending younger and tending suburban and independent, if it's apathetic or doesn't feel the need to vote, then Democrats could lose. And so McAuliffe loss would be interpreted as a lack of enthusiasm for Biden and a lack of enthusiasm among Democrats heading into 2018, where they hold the thinnest of margins in the House. One can't even argue that they hold a margin in the Senate. It is literally a tie, if it can even get to a tie, and rein in one or two senators who have not been supporting President Biden. So what Biden needs, what the Democrats need, is a victory, and a victory for the Biden program. That's going to mean voting rights, and that looks like that's stalled. That's also going to mean both infrastructure bills, in the same way that kind of federal largesse was able to secure a New Deal base for Franklin Roosevelt for a couple of generations, and then a Great Society base for Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats for a couple of at least one generation. Anyway, so it's looking bleak for the Democrats. We'll talk about the Republicans another time because it's not looking like there's anything really to cheer about. What's the Republican agenda except to say no, and to say no before they even hear what the program is. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and just talking about Virginia, I mean, really, it's going to come down to who can whip up enough fear about a boogeyman, right? In
That's true.
2020, the fear of the boogeyman was a second Trump term, and so that obviously motivated a lot of Democrats, all of their main bases, to hit the polls, and they hit the polls strong. But now that the Democrats are in power, we look to Virginia. Which side is more likely to feel that the end of the world is nigh and that they're going to be the victim? It's very difficult to predict these things, but at this moment, it looks to be that it could be in the favor of the Republicans, because some of those stories I'm talking about on the ground with very disgruntled, very disturbed parents showing up at board meetings, education meetings. One guy whose daughter was raped by a boy who became transgender in the bathroom and showed up to voice his concern and was dragged out of the meeting. Now I know that's one case, and maybe that's just a couple of those cases in the state, but stories like that can be hammered and really excite the fears in people, and say something in the message or the banner of, look where this country is headed. It's like the old Willie Horton in what was that, the 88 presidential election.
So, and interestingly, that Willie Horton ad was originally produced on behalf of Senator Al Gore, who was challenging Michael Dukakis for the presidential nomination, and the Republicans adopted it. And you remember it, or you've read about it. How many times was the Willie Horton ad run? Do you know?
I don't. I think I was only 5 at the time.
Yeah, it ran once on a Washington D.C. Station at news, and it was the free media after that. And then the showing of that ad, it went viral before there was a viral to even go to back in 1988. Just another useless fact that you can only get here on our podcast. Look, I think we've aired this out pretty well. Let's talk about the Republicans next time, okay? Because they deserve some scrutiny. But I do agree with you. Democrats are on the ropes right now. And I told a Wall Street Journal reporter a few weeks ago that critical race theory, while I support it, incidentally, but I think it can be and will be a huge albatross for the Democrats going into the election, simply because it has generated grassroots antipathy and intensity all over this country. When what goes on in school board meetings matters to the electorate at large and to the nation as a whole. You have a good week, and final word.
Yeah, just on the critical race theory, I mean, nobody wants to feel like they're born into a caste system. I mean, America is not supposed to be built on the notion of a caste system that whatever skin color you were born into, you have to carry the weight of, and maybe or maybe not your great grandfather owned slaves, but just because of the fact that you're white, you have to carry that load. And nobody wants to feel that way because we're supposed to be a meritocracy. And then the other thing I would just the thing that I would correct you on is, yeah, we can talk about the Republicans, but we want to leave room for real and unscripted, because who knows what's going to happen in the next week.
I stand corrected on that. Okay. Have a good week, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great week.